Hello, and thank you for joining in on the Aquatic Invasive Species Refresher. This is Amy Smagula, and I will be providing this overview. During the presentation, we'll cover aquatic plant identification, including some natives and some invasives. I'll also talk about aquatic animals, algae. I'll talk about where and how to obtain maps showing you plants that are growing in your lake. And then I'll talk about different layers of protection for your water body, including prevention activities and early detection activities, and then how we manage infestations, including rapid response activities and long-term management. Before we begin, I just wanted to talk about some of the zonation of aquatic plants and water bodies. We're going to start off talking first about the emergent plants, which are the ones that are close to shore. They're rooted in the substrate, but most of the plant material is above the surface of the water, usually right on the bank or sometimes in shallow water near the lake edge. Moving out a little bit deeper, we move into the floating leaved plant zone. Those include things like the common lilies that you're used to seeing, as well as floating heart and water shield, which are other lily type floating pad leaves. Those are usually connected to the lake bottom by some type of stem or petiole, and they're anchored there in place. Although we do have some floating plants that are completely free floaters. Moving a little bit deeper, we have submerged plants or plants that are completely underwater. Most of them are rooted, but not all, and they have most of their plant material completely underwater. So those are the different zones. And as I talk about some plants, including natives and invasives, I will talk about them in the context of their zone in the lake, so you know where to look. So starting off by just showing a few slides of native plants, and by native, I mean those that should be here, those that have evolved over time, and those that we typically view as beneficial for surface waters, including lakes, ponds, and rivers. So I'm going to start up on the upper left-hand side of each of these slides and go clockwise around them when I'm talking about the species. So starting off in the upper left is burrweed. This one has a straight stalk of a leaf that's about a foot or so tall. And then it has this little white spiky seed head in a cluster that forms usually in July. And those are typical along the lake edge. Burrweed also has a floating ribbon-like leaf form, but this is the one that falls into the emergent category. Sedges are next. Those are mixed in along the shoreline with other species like grasses and grasses and rushes. These are really common. They have stalks of green leaves that have edges. So if you roll them between your finger, they're usually three-sided. And then they produce these little brown-like seed heads that form sometime mid to late summer. So those are sedges. Moving over to the upper right is pipewort. Pipewort is a really common one in most lakes and ponds that have cobbly or sandy bottoms. These have little spiky stems or leaves on the lake bottom. It almost looks like astroturf. And then from those little leaves, these straight stalks with white button-like flowers come up through the water column, and those will be above the surface of the water. So that is another emergent. Rushes, I always say rushes are round. If you roll rushes between your fingers, they're round and smooth when you roll them, unlike the sedges, which have edges. But otherwise, rushes have straight green stalks, and also, like the sedges, these little brown spiky seed heads. Cattails are probably one of the more common species that most people will recognize. Cattails have tall sword-like leaves, and then they've got a separate stalk with this cigar-shaped seed head that forms at the tip of it. These are really common in wetlands and along lake edges, so cattails are a common emergent. Pickerelweed is in a lot of water bodies, almost most, I would say, and it's a shallow water plant, usually growing in 6 inches to about a foot of water. And it has a stalk with a leaf on it that's shaped sort of like a donkey's ear. And then it has a separate stalk with a pale purple flower on it. And these usually form decent sized stands around the shallows of lakes and ponds and in river systems. Arrowhead is the last one that I'll highlight here in the emergent native plant grouping. It has leaves that are A-shaped or arrow-shaped, thus the name arrowhead. And then it will produce these little white flowers, usually in July. So these are really common emergent plants that you'll find along your shallows and your shoreline areas on most lakes and ponds and river systems. Moving out into the floating leaf zone for native plants, there are some really familiar ones here that most people will recognize. White water lily. This one has a round leaf with a V-notch shape in it. And it has this white flower that's very obvious when it is in flower. You may see something that looks like this with a pinkish water lily. The pink lilies are not native. Somebody planted them. They have not evolved here over time. They're an ornamental and they are not a native, but the white ones are native. Floating heart, this one is a much smaller leaf and it's probably only an inch or two across. It's a tiny heart-shaped leaf, usually in clusters, and it is mixed in usually with the other lily species. Water shield is also usually mixed in. This one has an oval leaf. Sometimes they can turn whitish or reddish or yellowish on the surface, depending on time of year. As we get later in the season, they become a little bit more colorful. So that is another one you'll see. Yellow water lily. This one has a usually really big leaf, which is sort of heart-shaped at its base. And then the yellow flower. This is usually the first flower and actually the first aquatic plant to start growing in the spring after ice out. So you'll probably see this one first in the spring. And then the other one that has floating leaves to it is pondweeds. Some pondweeds will have floating leaves on the surface. These are more oval in shape, and if you look at them, you can see they've got all parallel lines across the leaf or down the length of the leaf. Those are the veins. That's a characteristic of that plant. So those are your common floating leaved native plants. And then moving into those underwater or submerged native plants, these all start to get a little tricky looking and looking alike, but also many of these have invasive plants that look a lot like them. And I'll call those out as we go through the invasives. Starting in the upper left again, this is the large bladderwort species that we have in New Hampshire. Bladderworts have leaves that split and branch as you get away from where it connects to the stem, and leaves are usually alternate. They're not perfectly whorled, except for one species, which I'll point out in a minute. Bladderwort has these little brownish or blackish seeds on it. And they're actually not seeds. Those are little bellies because this is a carnivore. And those little bladders will trap microscopic organisms and digest them for additional nutrients. But otherwise, the plant acts like a plant. It photosynthesizes and produces energy that way. This little, I call it a pom-pom. This little pom-pom is the reproductive structure of the plant. It produces it usually in the fall. That will fall off into the lake sediments, and that will give rise to a new plant, a new bladderwort plant next year. Moving over to the top middle, this is coontail. This one looks like some of the different invasives that we have. It also, like the bladderwort, has leaves that branch and split as you come out towards the end of the leaf. This one has little gaps between the whorls of leaves, and as you get closer to the tip, the leaves cluster, giving it this tassel-like appearance, which is why the plant is called coontail. Somebody thought it looked like a raccoon's tail at the tip. Over on the top right, this is whorled bladderwort. So instead of being alternate like the large bladderwort is, this one has leaves that are connected at a point and they rotate around the stem at different intervals to the stem. It does still have leaves that branch and split, and it has typically greenish or whitish bladders on it compared to the other bladderwort. We do have other bladderworts in New Hampshire, but they all are more similar to the large bladderwort. We only have one that's whorled like this one. Moving down to middle right, this is water naiad. This one is, we have a couple native species that look like this one. It's a very small plant that is usually low growing on the lake bottom, and it has needle-like leaves that are in little clusters along the stem. Down on the bottom right is robin's pondweed. This one has like a feather frond or ostrich fern type appearance, and it's usually really close to the lake bottom, kind of tucked along the sediment. Down in the bottom middle, native milfoil. This is just one species of native milfoil. We have a few, up to 6 in New Hampshire. This is one of the more common ones. It's browner or reddish in color, and it is usually just a few stems and a cluster and low growing on the lake bottom. Some of our other native milfoils are greener and they grow a little bit taller, but this is probably one of the more common ones that we have. Over on the bottom left is tape grass. This one looks like a long ribbon underwater. And then you may notice in the middle of the summer, there are these white spiral corkscrew type things that are coming up from the lake bottom. Those are the reproductive structures of the tape grass. And then finally, water weed. This is also called Elodea. This one has 2 species in New Hampshire that look alike. And it has these leaves that are almost like wide needles, or to me, they almost look like hemlock leaves. They're whorled around the main stem. And the significance with the native is that water weeds have leaves in whorls of 3 or less. So typically 3, but sometimes you may see 2. Sometimes you may see one where there are 4 leaves in a whorl, but mostly 3 leaves in a whorl. Now, for the underwater plants, some of them, most of them are in fact rooted to the lake bottom, unless it's the top 3 here. The bladderworts and the coontail are not rooted. They just float around, free floating. You may see them laying on the sediments, but that is just because they're just hanging out there. They are not rooted. They could float around at will. All right, so moving on to algae, just to do a comparison here. A lot of times you may see the green, fluffy algae that looks like clouds, or sometimes I call it cotton candy, but it's a very defined structure on the lake bottom that's got this kind of bubbly appearance to it. So that's usually filamentous green algae, and that's typically okay. Down at the bottom are a few different pictures showing you cyanobacteria, which is something that we're concerned about because it does produce toxins, or it can produce toxins. But the cyanobacteria here, you can see it's kind of this clumpy floating mass, or it's this little scum along the lake edge, or in worst case scenarios, it turns the entire water column a different color. So if you see anything that's scumming or washing up, or turning the water a different color, then we would definitely like to know about it. All algae would need a microscopic ID for verification. So if you want anything identified, please send it to us or drop it by our office in Concord, and we will look at it underneath the microscope to do a better identification. I just want to point out some resources that are available to you. If you would like to have a map showing you what plants we have documented in your water body, those maps are available to you online. All you need to do is go to Google or some other search engine that you use and type in DES Lake Mapper. You'll have a map of New Hampshire pop up, and you can zoom in on your water body of interest, click on it, and then you'll find a little box pop up with a list of reports that are available. If you look for Lake Assessment Report, those reports will have a map with the keys, the symbols on it, and a key associated with that, so that you can see historically what we've documented in your water body, so you can have a baseline for what plants are in your lake or pond. The survey date may vary and it may be out of date. However, we do have good confidence that a lot of these plants are fairly typical and representative of whenever the survey was done. We don't expect to see significant change over time. We only do a handful of lake assessments a year, and with 950 lakes and ponds in New Hampshire, it takes us a while to rotate through all of those water bodies. So you'll notice that there will be some surveys that seem like they're quite old, but rest assured that most of those plants should still be representative of what you have. And this is just an example of what we have in the DES Lake Mapper. So if you Google that and pull it up, this is what shows up, the map of New Hampshire. If you zoom in on a particular water body that you're interested in, here as an example, I zoomed in on the Connecticut River and I clicked on it. And then when I clicked on that water body, this box pops up. And if you scroll through this box, you can ultimately find lake assessment reports, and that's what you're looking for. Of course, we won't have lake assessment reports for rivers, just for lakes, but I just use this as an example. So you can get that same map and list that I just showed you. There are also depth maps and some data in those reports as well. All right, moving on to invasive plant and animal refresher. I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures of invasive plants and then animals, just to refresh you on what you should be looking for if you are out looking for invasive species or are an active participant in the state's Weed Watcher program. So these are all the bad ones, and you don't want these in your water body. So I'm going to start with emergent plants. So again, these are the ones that are rooted onshore and most of their vegetation is above the surface of the water. There are only a couple of invasives in this category that we're actively looking for at this point. The first one is purple loosestrife. This one has been around for a while. We've had ebbs and flows of these over the years where we've had a lot of it and then very little of it. That was due to a biocontrol project that was taking place where it actually reduced the purple loosestrife. But in the last couple of years, I've been noticing that this is making a comeback and it's creeping back into some places. So when you're weed watching or you're looking for this one, pay close attention to the shoreline areas and then also any wetlands in your watershed or roadsides where this one may be creeping in. Purple loosestrife has a four-sided stem or a square stem. Leaves are opposite or sometimes whorled. And then usually in July and August, you can see the magenta purple flower that forms at the top of the plant, which can indicate that it is purple loosestrife. There are some lookalikes to this, but the four-sided stem with opposite or whorled leaves coupled with this purple flower can help you with the ID. Common reed is another one. This one likes roadsides of highways or other roads. It can creep through culverts into water bodies or establish on shore and creep into your water body. Phragmites is a really tall plant. It can grow as tall as 15 feet tall, so the stalk is long. These leaves are bigger and sword-like, and then usually late summer, early fall, these brown seed heads form. This is what the plant looks like when it's a newer population, only about a year or two old, forming on a shoreline or a bank. And then you can see here it's sending these runners out into the water to further colonize out deeper into this water body here. So just keep an eye out if you see this really tall grass species on your shoreline that looks like it's making a run for deeper water. It could be a Phragmites, and it most likely is Phragmites. Moving into the floating leaf zone, right now we only have one that we're actively looking for. This is water chestnut. The water chestnut is going to be in that floating leaf zone where the lily pads are. Luckily, it doesn't look anything like the lily pads that I described to you earlier. This one has triangular shaped leaves that are toothed, and they form a rosette that floats on the surface. That rosette is anchored to the bottom with a stalk. And then it forms these seeds on the underside of this rosette, usually midsummer. So if you see anything that looks like this or this, that is something that we want to know about. Here's a good picture of the rosette that was just picked out of the water. And this is a really dense bed of water chestnut when it gets thick and gets all piled on top of each other in a water body. So moving into that underwater invasive plant zone, this is, again, as I mentioned, for the native submersed, this is a tricky zone because a lot of things look alike. So for the invasive submergent plants, we have variable milfoil. This one is the most abundant invasive plant in New Hampshire, the most common and the most abundant in terms of plant density. The variable milfoil has really thick leaf growth along the main stem, and the stem itself can be reddish or greenish or brownish sometimes. But it's really the density and the fullness of this growth along the stem that help with an ID, among other factors. Uh, the leaves of this plant look like feathers on a bird. Some of the other plants that I described have branching or forking, splitting leaf types. This one looks like a true feather on a bird. It has a midrib and then little leaflets that are paired here. So no splitting or branching. It's just like a feather. When you look at it underwater, it's got this really full growth here, and it comes up through the water column. Think of it like a squirrel's tail. If you picture a gray squirrel's tail, that's sort of the shape of growth that we tend to see. And there's a picture of it when it gets really thick. These things on the top of the water here are flower stalks. It may or may not flower. It doesn't really need to because it reproduces by fragmentation, where a piece of the plant can spread it. But sometimes if it reaches the surface early, it will flower, usually in July, forming these little flower stalks at the surface where it will produce seed. Eurasian water milfoil. This is, again, a milfoil species, so feather-like leaf whorled around the main stem. The natives do also have feather-like leaves, but they're not typically perfectly whorled. And again, the natives are much smaller, usually. Uh, Another thing with this one, in addition to the feather-like leaves, unlike the variable milfoil, which I just showed you, this one isn't as fluffy or full. It has bigger gaps between the whorls of leaves that you can see here. And another interesting little identifying factor, if you have the vision and the patience, you can count out the little pairs of leaflets along a stem. And there are 12 or more pairs of leaflets on Eurasian water milfoil. So if you look for the leaflet pairs and the gaps between the leaf whorls, and you have both, it's probably Eurasian water milfoil. Fanwort, this one has leaves that are branching and splitting, and they're shaped like a fan. Another thing about this one is that the leaves are opposite. So they are not whorled, they're opposite each other on the main stem. So over on the left here, we can see this reddish main stem coming down. And each pair of leaflets has a little stalk that comes off that the leaf attaches to. So you can see this alternating pattern all the way, I'm sorry, the opposite pattern all the way down the stem. But when you look at it in the water, it can look a lot like the milfoils, and it's a good idea to always collect a sample and lay it out and see what the leaf shape is, what the leaves look like, and the arrangement of the leaves on the main stem, as that will help you. Are the leaves feather-like? Are they branching or forking? Are they opposite? Are they whorled? These are all different things to help you with identification. Curly leaf pondweed is another plant that is showing up more and more. This one has narrow leaves that are probably about 1/4 of an inch wide and really wavy edges to the leaves. The leaves are also crisp like fresh lettuce. So you'll probably see this one growing low in a water body, about 1 or 2 feet tall in most cases. And it's very distinct with these super wavy edges to the leaves. Even though it's called curly leaf pondweed, it's more of a wavy leaf. Water naiad is another one. This one looks like the native water naiads, except that it has these really bent back or recurved leaves to it. And the leaves also have teeth that you can see with the naked eye. So there are little teeth along each leaf of this plant. The plant is typically low growing, maybe only about 6 inches tall. So aren't the natives. But you can see underwater that these have more of a recurving or curved backs leaf to them when you take a look at them. And you can see the teeth when you pick out a sample of it and take a closer look. So hydrilla is not here yet, but I do worry about this one. Hydrilla can grow 25 feet tall in dark water. It can fragment very easily and spread, and birds can move this one by eating this little tuber and depositing it in their waste product. So hydrilla can move very quickly in a lot of different ways. It is not far from us. It's in every state around us except Vermont right now. So it is definitely an imminent threat to us. This one looks a lot like the native elodea or water weeds that I talked about a little while ago, except this one, if you were to look at it, it has leaves that are in whorls of 4 or more. The native has leaves in 3 or less. So the invasive, 4 or more leaves in a whorl. And the leaves themselves have little teeth on the edges, so that should help with identification too. The natives have smooth leaves. And this one is a new one that I want to highlight because I have seen it on the move. I first found this one in Lake Winnipesaukee in 2020 in a couple of coves off Paugus Bay in Laconia. And it has since spread to other water bodies in the area, larger lakes and ponds. So it's definitely a concern. It can spread by fragmentation with boaters moving it around. I also think that waterfowl are spreading this actively. The new locations where this plant has popped up after the initial population uh, is not anywhere where I think boaters would go. So I think it could be a high risk for waterfowl to move. The plant looks a lot like milfoil underwater. It does have feather-like leaves, but they're much bigger and broader, and the plant overall is bigger itself. The leaves are more alternate as opposed to whorled, but they can also be whorled. And then it's sort of a triple threat because the plant will grow happily rooted in the substrate. It will grow happily exposed on muddy edges around a water body. And then it will also be happy free floating in the water body as little clusters of the plant. So um, I worry about this one persisting. It's called water violet because usually in May it produces these pale violet or purplish flowers. So if you see anything that looks like this, please do just check in with me and let me know that you might have something like this, and photos always do help for ID. So water violet is a new one to watch out for. Moving into invasive aquatic animals, I have a couple of these. Asian clam, this one is in New Hampshire. It's roughly the diameter of a dime, so fairly small. They can be brownish to olive colored to sometimes really dark brown or black. And they're more of a rounded shape to them. And the distinction is that these have these pronounced ridges along the shell. So you can feel those ridges with your fingernail or your finger. So if you see anything like this on your lake bottom, sometimes they dig into the lake bottom. I had to use this little strainer to dig some out, but sometimes they're right on the lake bottom. You can see evidence that they're present by these cast off shells. These are shells of dead Asian clam. This is a lake bottom just littered with them, and you can see that they do tend to accumulate in fish beds where they can cause problems for fish laying eggs or for other aquatic life that lives on the bottom. Asian clam are a concern because they're hermaphroditic. They have both male and female organs within one shell, so one introduced into a water body could pose a threat. Also, their larvae are microscopic and can move in water, so they can move a couple of ways as adults or juveniles. The Chinese mystery snail has been a long time invasive animal in New Hampshire. We first found it in the 80s in Lake Winnisquam, and from there it has moved on to dozens of water bodies across New Hampshire. So over here on the left, you see it compared to the size of a quarter. The Chinese mystery snail is actually in 3D. You can compare it to the size of a golf ball. It's a really big snail. Over here in this container are some other snails that are also large that you may see or compare it to, but they're not nearly as big as the Chinese mystery snail. Um, so also another thing is that these will be either on the lake bottom typically, or they may be attached to vegetation or other surfaces underwater, but the size is a giveaway. Most of our native snails are so small that you won't find them easily visible in a water body. The zebra mussel, this one we do not have in New Hampshire yet. It is around us in all states except for Maine. The zebra mussel is small. It's about the size of a pistachio nut, and it's about a D-shaped. So you get a flat side and then the other side arcs out. And it can be black or white or tan or white, banded in some type of banding pattern like you see on the bottom right here. And it won't necessarily be lying still on the bottom. It's most likely going to be attached to some type of hard surface in the lake, like the dock or boat or another mussel in the water body, a native mussel. And they can all pile on to each other. So if you see clusters of tiny mussels that are sticking to things, it's a good idea to let us know. And the last one I'm going to mention is the spiny water flea. This one is, we have native water fleas, which are perfectly normal. This one has this long silica tail attached to it. So it is bigger and the tail makes it even bigger. And it's a problem for the food web in lakes and also to anything that eats water fleas, because this will get trapped in their mouth parts and in their gut, which will make digestion difficult. So if you pull out fishing lines or anything that might have something like this attached to it, then it is something that you may want to report. They might be hard to see in the water column. Then again, they might not be because they're a little bit bigger. This is one perched on somebody's fingertip. So that was the overview of species. I just want to give you a visual perspective of the infestations in New Hampshire. Right now, the southern half of New Hampshire is where our infestations are located. We have not found anything yet in the northern half of our state. Most of our infestations are variable milfoil. So all these red dots that you see are variable milfoil. And then you can see the distribution of other species that I mentioned in this presentation. There are a scattering of other things around the state, all generally increasing in number to some degree, but variable milfoil still continues to be the big mover. So the invasive species mantra, and something that you guys should think about for your own water body, is having layers of protection: prevention, early detection, rapid response, and management. You want to have some type of prevention activities for your water body. Most new infestations start at the boat launch, so having signs at the boat launch. We have signs that are for free that I'm happy to send you. Having informational kiosks set up to educate people who are using the water body. And if your water body is large enough and busy enough, a lake host could help out with doing courtesy boat inspections and educating boaters about reducing the spread of invasive species. Early detection is by weed watchers and others who monitor water bodies and keep an eye out for invasive species. So if you're interested in becoming a weed watcher and you're not already, please reach out to me. And I do have weed watcher kits and other materials that we can share, including videos like this on our website for trainings and refreshers as needed. And then if you do find something, we move into the rapid response long-term management phase. And the word about management is the earlier something is found, the better we can manage it and the more likely we can eradicate it. If something is too widespread when we first find it, eradication may not be a word that we can even use. It might immediately kick you into the long-term management phase. And management is integrated using a number of techniques and adaptive, where we survey, assess what's going on and adapt our management to the type and degree of infestation as it changes over time. So if you're out looking and you think you found something, we ask that you collect a voucher specimen and do that carefully so you don't cause take of a species that is a native, or that you break something off if it's a plant and cause it to spread elsewhere. So if it's an animal, we ask that you only take one, and preferably photograph it and return it in case it's a rare species. And if it's a plant, just be careful not to let pieces float off from where you break it off. And what to do with your voucher specimen. The best situation, which is the quickest situation, is to email me a digital photo of what you found. So for that, I recommend taking the specimen and laying it out on a piece of white paper or a paper towel or napkin, and then putting something near it, like a coin, pen, a ruler for scale is helpful. Just make sure you arrange all of the plant parts or animals so that it can be clearly seen next to the scaled item. Take a digital picture of that layout and then email it to me, and I should get back to you in minutes or hours, depending on what I'm doing and where I am. The other alternative is to snail mail it to me. And in that case, you would wrap it in a moist paper towel, seal it in a Ziploc bag, and then mail it to me at Concord, or drop it off at Concord offices. The email option is the best. If you do email me something, I do suggest that you hold on to the specimen until I do an ID. Sometimes for some species, I might need to do DNA to confirm what that species is. So just hold on to it until I give an all clear. And by holding on to it, it's just putting it in a baggie and just storing it in your fridge until you hear back from me. So if we do find a new infestation and you found it, I verified it, or someone else on the state level verified it, and if it's a non-native, we will be out to survey your water body and map the infestation. And then we'll work on containment actions if they're applicable, and then move into management actions based on the type and the degree of the infestation. And then if it's a long-term management effort, we'll create a long-term management plan for your water body, and we will use that as a guide for management. So that is the overview refresher. Please email me if you have questions or you need signs or weed watcher kits or other materials, or certainly if you find something that you just want identified, I'm happy to take a look at specimens. Thank you.